All right, you've seen the thumbnail, right? You saw the thumbnail. So back in like January or whatever, when they went and did another run of the Squidmar Ultras, go to the right side, from Harder and Steenbeck, I decided to pick one up. I've never used an airbrush, so I decided, you know what? It's a good time to get into it. It's a good thing to have, even with being only like a beginner when it comes to miniature painting. I think it can help me improve. It's a tool that I can use to improve. So I decided to pick it up. And I'm going to test on paper like I did with the other one, so that, you know, I kind of know what I'm doing a little bit, or I can at least practice my control and stuff. Then I have a bunch of these Elegoo towers from trying to get all my print settings and everything right for my Jupiter. What I want to do for this video, after I've, you know, tested these out, I want to paint this whole tower with airbrush, with just using the airbrush. Okay, so back when I first used this airbrush back in January, I ran into a few problems. Most were probably from inexperience and lack of research though. The only thing that I had watched at the time to learn about using an airbrush was the video that you get from Harder and Steenbeck about how to use the airbrush. My biggest hurdle back then was trying to figure out the color on the airbrush and the ratio between thinner and paint. On the airbrush, there is a color with different settings to help out beginners like me. There's a prime setting, a base coat setting, and a 1, 2, and 3 setting, along with a full trigger travel setting. Basically, each of these settings is just an indentation into the collar to stop the trigger from going back farther. And it's supposed to help you control how much paint is going out of the nozzle. You know, it's mostly a feature for beginners like me to use while learning how to control the airbrush better, or control the paint flow better. So in the Harder and Steenbeck video, they tell you to put it on setting 2 to start out. Yeah. I couldn't get this to work, like, at all the first time around. I thought maybe the gun was broken, but when I switched it from there to the full trigger travel setting, it worked fine, and I just had to pull back farther. Like, looking at what I know now, I think there are 2 possible reasons for this. I'm not an expert, but I think these are the 2 reasons that it could have been doing that. 1, my compressor's PSI isn't right. Or 2, the ratio between thinner and paint leaned too much towards the paint side, so it was too thick. I'm not sure about any of this, but that's what I was kind of figuring. Well, that was my first time using the airbrush, and that's the video. Deuces. Nah, I'm just kidding. But that was my first time using the airbrush about 8 months ago. Now, I've learned a bit more about the airbrush and how to do airbrushing. I watched and took notes on Squidmar Miniatures airbrushing video, so I now have a greater pool of knowledge to pull from than just the one video. And I am going to start by just airbrushing some paper and trying to get used to using it and the flow and everything. But even with that knowledge, I still can't get 1, 2, and 3 to work. Like, I can't. I don't know how. Like, this time, I don't know what's wrong. I'm using paint that is made for airbrushing. I'm using Army Painter's airbrush war paints. They're pure red to practice with. I filled up the airbrush's hopper a bit and started spraying and clicking through the settings on the collar. And the prime, base, and full travel settings, they all worked fine. And paint comes out and it looks decent. But when I click it over to the 1, 2, 3 settings, they just don't work for me. And I don't know why. Like, I don't know what I'm doing wrong with the paint or the compressor or the airbrush, and it's a bit of an annoyance. So I just said screw it, and I left it on the full travel setting and just felt out how to control how much paint comes out that way. I did notice what to the untrained eye could maybe be considered speckling when I was spraying the paper, so I decided to test a few different PSI settings on my compressor and see what would be the best. And since I felt like there was a lot of speckling going on when spraying the paper, I tried kicking it up to 35 PSI. I don't think that made it worse, but it didn't feel like it improved it very much. Then I turned it down to 15 PSI, which...
No, definitely not.
I think it was noticeably worse, but I finally settled on 20 psi, which I used for the rest of the video because I think that helped with the speckling the most. After that, I just used up the rest of the paint that was in the hopper and kind of made the different test papers that I had look like Rorschach tests. And that is it for, as Jazza would say, my dabble into using an airbrush. Now it's time to dive into painting my tower. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I plan to do everything with the airbrush. That means priming and painting. So I grabbed the Army Painter Matte Black airbrush primer and went to work priming it. This is where another problem arose a few times. Clogging. During priming, the nozzle or needle clogged up a few times. I think I counted maybe 4. So going with how Squidmar suggests, I grabbed some IPA and a Q-tip to clean it out and get it all working again. I did add a little bit of thinner to see if that would help with better flow, but I don't really think it made that big of a difference. But in the end, I got the tower primed and ready to lay down some paint. I decided to start off with more of the pure red from the Army Painter airbrush line. When working on this section, I wanted the top of the spiral to be fully red and have it bleeding or overspraying into the second part of the spiral. But I didn't want that to be like fully red. I kind of wanted red on the top side of it. So I left the second spiral a bit lighter than the top of the spiral with the red. Now is where I start doing something, then I change my mind right away after I've done the first little bit. I was going to just paint the whole base of the tower red, but then I changed my mind and decided to have it go along the base of the tower so that it would paint half the Elegoo Jupiter words red and leave the top half black. Once I finished doing that part of the base, I cleaned out my airbrush and started with the next color. I grabbed some royal purple from the same Army Painter line and sprayed the bottom half of the same spiral that the red was on. I went for the same type of thing as the red, made the bottom fully purple and had it bleed or overspray into the red a little bit. And I really like how this spiral turned out. And once that spiral was done, I decided to paint the very base of the tower beneath the red where it looked kind of like stone with that purple. And so far, just at this point, I think the tower turned out really well. But then I started to experiment more. So I wanted to try doing a gradient. You know, shade, mid-tone, highlight, that type of gradient. And I wanted to mix my own colors so I'm not just stuck with the Army Painter airbrush line or having to go buy the Vallejo airbrush line or any of that. And mixing these colors, boy did this not work out that well for the first part. So I decided to do a green gradient. I mixed airbrush thinner, flat green, and black from Vallejo's model color line together in the hopper, which was a pretty dumb idea. I think I mixed in a bit too much black because when I started spraying, the dark green kind of showed up on the primer when it was wet. After it dried, unless you point it out, you can't really tell that I had painted that area with a dark green because it just looked black. I think I didn't get a good ratio of green to black, so that's where it screwed it up. Even now, writing the script after the fact, it just looks like black with some green overspray from the mid-tone. I used this color to spray the bottom of the other spiral that I hadn't painted yet, and then I decided to do something dumb, and I sprayed the unprimed bottom of the tower with this green like the idiot I am. It doesn't really stick very well to just pure resin. It's sticking enough, but not that well. Once I finished with the dark green, I cleaned everything up and decided to finish it up the next day. The next day, I started with just a base flat green, the same green I used with that dark green mix. I wanted to put this flat green in kind of the central parts of the spiral. And I think doing that with the overspray helped actually blend in the dark green to this color. And then once I put the final color on, I think that transition works decently well. Before I added in that final lighter highlight, I decided to paint the outside of the top of the tower and that small little lip under it with this flat green, just to kind of give it a good base layer. Then I added some white and more thinner to the hopper to make it a bit of a lighter green. And this kind of green-white mix, it came out much lighter and a lot brighter when it's wet. But I think I did the same thing I did with the black, and I put in too much white, because when it dries, it becomes very desaturated. At the time when spraying it, I thought it looked good. I'm like, it's not neon, it's not really bright neon, but it's also lighter than the other one. So I'm like, oh, this will look really good. And now that I'm looking at it after it's fully dried, it's really desaturated, and I honestly don't like the color that much. Then again, this tower is just for practice, and it is probably the ugliest paint job you'll see today. So for this lighter color, I wanted to go and make it along the top edge of the spiral for the green, which I did, and I thought, you know, like I said, initially it looked really good. Now that it's dried, it's a bit desaturated, but I think it kind of works that transition a little bit. It's not great, but I think it kind of works. Once I finished that spiral, the top of that spiral, then I moved to the top of the tower because I wanted to get that like the sun was beating down on it. So I wanted it to look like kind of the sun was hitting that a lot, and I just sprayed kind of like top down so that I could get the rampart top and the landing of the top of the tower, as well as the top of the stairs going down that you could see from there. I also tried to spray the like top edge of the outer rampart so that that would give kind of the same look and hopefully transition into that flat green, which I think there it worked out well, but on the spiral I don't think it worked out as well. To finish up, I tried to get into the tower with the airbrush and spray the two twisting bits of resin in there with the green, and you know, kind of do some of the top of the stairs that I couldn't get from the top with this green. I also started to paint like the bottom section of the tower with that incline, but my airbrush started to clog it there, so I just said, you know what, screw it, I'm gonna leave it as is, and I'm gonna call it good. I think this was a really good practice, and that's my first time using an airbrush on a mini. I know, you've watched the whole video. This is the outro, and this is the ugliest thing you have probably seen on YouTube today. Just this paint job. It's not pretty. It's not meant to be pretty. This is just me trying. This is me testing, like I said at the beginning of the video. First time using an airbrush, and it turns out with this result, I'm completely fine with it. And that's without using brushes or anything. I like the transition from red to purple. Sure, it's not like, you know, an insanely clean transition. I could have cleaned stuff up, I could have done that, but I like how it turned out. I'm fine with the green not being great. I'm fine with it not being perfect, not being like, you know, up to other people's standards, because I'm starting out, I'm learning, and that's how I'm gonna evolve my painting style. For the first time using it, I am very satisfied with how this looks. It's testing out, it's playing around, it's learning. This was my dive into this. With all of these just being my testing, with like these 3 sheets just being my play around and my test with this, and then going from that to this, and it translating and like actually learning and being a starting point, I really like it. And I'm ready to use my airbrush on my Necrons and on like all the other stuff that I want to make and I want to do. It's just another tool for me to use, and I'm really excited to actually use this more. But yeah, that's gonna be it for this video. And yes, this is a primer. This is a bit of a primer to not the next video, but the next kind of series that I'm working on, which is finishing up my Necron Combat Patrol. I'm gonna start getting ready for doing that. But next week, I am gonna be talking about Magic the Gathering, because I'm getting into that as another hobby. Or I'm getting back into that as another hobby. So yeah, that'll be next week's video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you have a royal day, and I will talk to you in the next one.